As protests turn violent over the expansion of a chemical plant in the eastern Chinese city of Ningbo, we ask, how can China achieve the right balance between its ambitious plans for economic growth and their environmental cost? And what are the challenges ahead for China's leadership as it gets ready for a transition of power? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ghida Fakhry. Chinese authorities are halting work on a chemical factory in an eastern port city after a week of protests. Thousands of people demonstrated against the expansion to a plant using potentially harmful chemicals. Although environmental protests have recently become more common in China, this time they highlight a major challenge for the country's leadership as it gets ready for a transition of power. Caroline Malone has more.
These are the kind of scenes China's new leaders won't want to see. Public anger at big business, less than 3 weeks before a handover of power in Beijing. Now, after a week of protests in the eastern city of Ningbo, a planned expansion of a petrochemical plant has been cancelled. People here were worried about its use of a potentially cancer-causing chemical.
They're going to build a PX petrochemistry plant. This is very harmful to people's health. 90% of the people around here will be suffering from cancer. Children will be born with disabilities.
The crowd also demanded the release of fellow protesters who were detained after earlier demonstrations. They marched to local government offices but were stopped by a wall of security officers.
Nowadays, our life conditions are getting worse. Apart from the plant that they want to expand, there are many other petrochemical industries in the area. They make the environment very dangerous.
It's not often such a large number of people question decisions made by state-backed businesses in China. But it seems leaders and officials are now listening. In July, people rallied against an industrial waste pipeline in Jiangsu. Some of them forced their way into a government office, and as a result, the project was cancelled. But this is a sensitive time. Beijing's new leaders will be hoping for a smooth transition of power. Although they're not voted into power by the majority, they'll be aware of people's growing demands and a growing willingness to stand up for their health and the environment. Caroline Malone for Inside Story.
So what will it take then for China to find a balance between its economic growth and environmental concerns? Well, let's discuss this with our guest in Hong Kong, Joseph Cheng, Professor of International Politics at City University. In London, Roderic, China analyst and associate fellow at Chatham House. And in Beijing, Li Bo, a board member and a former executive director of Friends of Nature. It is the oldest environmental NGO in China. Welcome to you all. Li Bo, in Beijing, the government seems to be bowing, at least for now, to public pressure by halting work on this latest industrial project. To what extent does it reflect the Chinese government's willingness to listen to environmental concerns? To what extent is it designed to simply limit the political fallout from these ongoing protests?
Well, if you look at what has happened in the past 2 to 3 years, there have been a number of cases like this, and civil societies, especially everyday people, are very confused about how those projects were decided and how they were, be delivered at the local levels. So I think my understanding is that the central government level, they are very concerned, and they are fully aware of those environmental challenges, and the rhetorics of GDP at the local level were just so strong, and they are not really working in coordination to deal with those issues.
How serious a threat to the environment and to people's health do these projects really represent?
I have read a few articles written by local households, and I think their concerns are all very sensible, and they were expressing that they don't know how those projects were decided, and they don't know how the other PX projects were cancelled in Xiamen and Dalian, but this one were continued, still in implementation. They are asking what measures were taken to make sure that this project is better than the others. There are evidence that such projects are very potentially harmful if we don't use state-of-art technologies and with a good participation of the local communities to make sure the implementation are up to the standard.
Professor Cheng, this latest decision then by the government to halt work on this industrial plan, was this an admission by the government, however implicit, that there might have been serious potential harmfulness to these projects on the environment, on people's health, or was this simply an issue of this being really the last thing the leadership in Beijing needed at this time as it readies itself for that transition of power?
Well, as Mr. Lee has just pointed out, there are differences in terms of perspectives and in terms of interest considerations between the central government and the local government. Usually, the local government is interested in the promotion of GDP growth, in the launch of large petrochemical projects or large industrial projects. These projects and high industrial growth rates are usually seen as important indicators in support of the advancement of the political careers of the local officials. However, it is also common that the local residents are concerned with the environmental impact and the health hazards caused by these projects. They normally do not trust the local government. They do not believe in the environmental impact assessment reports prepared, and they are very suspicious of corruption. And they have also been encouraged by previous successful precedents to stop these projects through protest activities. On the part of the central leadership, there is certainly more consideration given to environmental protection. There is, of course, a serious concern about social and political instability, and central government normally would not side with local officials when they perceive huge waves of protests against the local governments.
Roderic, why? You just heard the view there that much of these decisions that seem to be made in Beijing by what appears to be a rather limited clique of officials who essentially seem to be calling the shots on many of these projects. To what extent does it have to do with that this type of model is being pursued because it promotes GDP growth at the expense of the environment and people's health? To what extent is it also a realization on the part of the central government that there is now an increasingly savvy public they are faced with, a public that is willing to take to the streets to force the government to back down on some of these projects?
Well, as others have said, I mean, there is certainly a real concern in the central government about social stability. And we know that the budget for internal control is the same or bigger than the defence budget. So these are real matters of concern. Secondly, I think a lot of the protests that we see are generated by environmental concerns, and they're also generated by land requisitions by local government, often for development of industrial development. So there is a widespread feeling, in many widespread resentment about the way in which industrial development goes ahead without local consultation and is very little regulated or supervised concerning the effects that it might have on local people. And we now see many instances of people complaining to local government, failing to get their complaints listened to, and then taking to the streets.
And of course, there have been a lot of changes in China over the last 4 decades. In fact, in just 35 years, the ruling Communist Party made China an economic giant. As the party now prepares for a major change in leadership this coming November, people are increasingly becoming more vocal about environmental issues. But let's perhaps take a quick look at other challenges ahead for China. Now, as the Chinese economy grew, the gap between rich and poor has also widened, creating a more unequal society. Also, the population is aging, and the one-child policy means fewer young workers to pay for more retirees. Another challenge facing China's leadership is corruption within its own ranks. The former party chief of the southern city of Chongqing has been accused of abuse of power, and his wife has been recently convicted of involvement in the murder of a businessman. And this week, a New York Times report said relatives of Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao became extraordinarily wealthy after he ascended to the top levels of power. Finally, territorial disputes with Japan over a group of islands in the East Asian Sea have also created a major challenge. Li Bo, with so much on its plate, how much attention will the government in Beijing give this issue, this environmental issue?
As far as I understand, environment is a central concern, and I think in the past 2 to 3 years, we have seen some willingness that, for instance, in order to facilitate a meaningful public participation, there have been a regulation issued for disclose environment informations, and also there are some process requested for public participation in environment impact assessment. But what I don't see, I think it's due to the very low efficiency of the bureaucracy. Most of the implementation of those policies, regulations are kind of less forthcoming or less efficient when there is no high stake. When you put in a request for this information, they oftentimes get rejected, or they give you something that are not very relevant. So I think intention is clearly there, but this bureaucracy moves kind of slow on environment governance issues.
How opaque, Professor Cheng, how transparent does this whole debate remain, though? Do people have sufficient access to key information they may need on some of these projects that could have a very detrimental effect on their health, on the environment? Do they have enough access to this type of information?
The central government in recent years certainly has been paying more attention to the issue of environmental protection. There are laws implemented, and projects of this kind normally requires an environmental impact assessment report and so on. But in the case of China, the problem often lies at implementation. On one hand, local governments are eager to attract investment to establish these projects, to promote local economic growth, to enhance local employment opportunities, and therefore they tend to be easy on the project and on the enterprises involved in the project. At the same time, we all understand that corruption is a serious problem. Many enterprises believe that it is easier to pay corruption money to offer bribery to get things done rather than spending massive sums of money to ensure that environmental protection standards are properly met. Hence, in general, people have very little confidence and trust in the local governments. They do not believe that the proper environmental assessment work has been done. There are strong suspicions, and as we explained, there is also a belief that because of successful precedents, they probably guess that if they mobilize enough people to protest, they may be able to stop these projects, because on the part of the central government, there is a rather high level of tolerance for environmental interest groups, because they are not seen to be flattening the monopoly of political power in the hands of the party regime.
Roderic, why? We're just talking, as you heard, about the fact that more and more people seem to be taking part in the debate, taking to the streets in what appear to be much more frequent demonstrations against government policies. To what extent are these demonstrations a reminder to the next generation of leaders in Beijing that they are now facing a more skeptical public that is not willing to accept the rapidly dizzying economic growth that China has known over the last few years, at whatever expense it comes?
I think there is a real problem over growth versus the consequences of growth. And of course these become more apparent as growth itself slows down. When the promise of a better tomorrow looks as though it might be fulfilled, people are willing to put up with more. When the promise of the better tomorrow may not so necessarily be fulfilled, and today is looking extremely grim, I think it is much more difficult for the government to contain the rising tide of protest in China.
How does the government, though, reconcile between this and the need for continued economic growth?
Well, it certainly does need to continued economic growth. I think what we have seen in many of these cases is the central government allowing, as it were, the local government to take the blame. We hear that the central government has environmental policies, has passed environmental laws and regulations, and indeed it has, and it does take concern at that level. But what happens at the lower levels is that these regulations often don't get implemented. People push through things in, as our other colleagues have said, in a corrupt way, and very little concern is taken of the effect that it might have on local people. And this remains a real problem.
Professor Cheng, just looking at the way the government has handled this situation after a few days of protests, seemingly backtracking, the way it handled the other mass protests that took place in August of 2011 against the PX plant in Dalian and another two major protests that also took place that year, are we likely to see a major shift in long-term approach by this government?
Well, the government understands all these problems. Certainly, it would like to pay more attention to environmental protection, is willing to spend more money there, and at the same time, it wants to upgrade industries to move towards a knowledge-intensive stage of economic growth, whereas today, the emphasis is still very much on heavy industries. As we said, the difficulty is usually at the implementation level. You see, local governments also suffer from the fact that because of the need to provide more and more social services as demanded by the central government to maintain social stability, to contain the grievances generated by the widening of the gap between the rich and poor, these local governments have to raise money. And the easiest way to raise money is to engage in real estate development projects, to attract investment, to start these large industrial plants and so on. And there is a contradiction. You have to appreciate that on the part of the local government, they need to raise money to meet the increasing demands due to urbanization and due to the building of a basic social security net covering the urban and in fact the entire population. There is, of course, the issue of corruption all the time.
How does the issue of corruption, Li Bo, affect the decisions that are made, and to what extent can public participation limit the influence that certain powerful lobbies, interest groups have?
Well, I certainly believe with full public participation and information disclosure, if people can get involved before a project is decided, especially during the feasibility studies, and if information can be shared and discussed, various public hearings can be conducted, there will be much more difficult for some of those corruptions to take place. I also would like to add, besides the implementation being a problem, I think the central government somehow has to commit. I would like to see that maybe in the next government, that the law, the environment protection law, which is going through some potential amendment right now, the environment law needs to set a new standard for, let's say, the fine for the discharge, illegal discharge. Right now, the illegal discharge is just, the fine is too low. So we have a saying in China that committing a crime, a discharge crime, is simply cheaper than following the laws to taking the rigorous clean-up procedures. So we need to have a very strong, committed environment law to make sure the discharge, illegal discharge, or taking a sort of a shortcut to make a dirty environment, those behavior from the enterprise side has to be controlled or reduced, and they somehow have to. We have to force them to take that into account of their total calculation of cost and benefit.
Roderic, how likely is that to happen? How likely are China's leaders to accept the idea of having mechanisms that make sure that there are checks and balances?
I'm sure at the central level we will see increasing interest in this kind of thing, and the environmental laws will be updated and improved. But there are real problems at the implementation level of how much of the actual economic cost to enterprises to pollute rather than to prevent pollution. And for quite a considerable time to come, I think this will be a major difficulty. I don't think we will see the kind of transparency of information that many would like to see. We won't see the enforcement of the regulations, strict enforcement of the regulations, and we won't see the kind of monitoring that many would also like to see. It takes a long time to get that kind of thing socialized into the Chinese system.
Professor Cheng, is it a matter of time, though? Will these problems eventually catch up with the authorities with so much of the air polluted and so much of the water as well?
Yes, I do agree with the English scholar's comment. I believe it is quite likely that the central leadership will strengthen the environmental protection laws and statutes, but the central leadership is not yet ready to accept effective checks and balances mechanisms. That is to say, just like the issue of corruption, in order to fight corruption, in order to protect the environment better, the central leadership, of course, has to allow better monitoring on the part of the media, better monitoring on the part of the local people's congresses. But unfortunately, these checks and balances mechanisms are seen as a threat to the monopoly of power in the hands of the party. And the central leadership is not willing to allow a free media, an effective People's Congress system to function properly. And that is why, although the central leadership is aware of the problem, it is willing probably to strengthen the laws, but then you still have serious problems with implementation and with corruption.
Libo, how confident, though, are you that the central leadership will eventually have to deal with this issue sooner rather than later?
When I'm facing all the environment pollution cases in the past few years, oftentimes you get very pessimistic about the whole situation, how soon and how fast it can get cleaned up, and whether it is possible, because we are discharging a lot of pollutants to the soil, to the water, and their accumulated impact are now showing up. And that's why you see increasingly more and more people are becoming very uncomfortable. So that side is very depressing. But on the other side, you see increasingly, the communities, household communities, they are increasingly interested in their health issues. Unlike before, 10 years ago, they always talk about, oh, let's have development first, and then we take care of the environment second. I think that attitude is changing, and also there are limited number of NGOs are now making specific requests for information disclosures. I think those efforts at the grassroots level are are very, very key to make sure that government do those things. And for instance, oftentimes when we put in a request and they don't even know where to find that information, that just shows me how even the filing system is so chaotic. So there are a long way to go. I'm kind of pessimistic, but I don't want to lose hope.
Well, on this note, we'll leave our discussion there. Thanks to all our guests on this edition of Inside Story in Hong Kong, Joseph Cheng in London, Roderic Wine in Beijing,
Thank you.
Li Bo. And of course, thank you very much, as always, for joining us on today's Inside Story. You can always send us your feedback by emailing us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Ghida Fakhry, and the entire team here in Doha, thanks for watching.